You know, I've always considered myself a pretty patient person. I can wait in line at the DMV without my soul visibly leaving my body. I can listen to my Aunt Carol recount the same story about her prize-winning petunias for the seventh time, and I can even tolerate those impossibly slow drivers in the fast lane. But when the Homeowners Association, spearheaded by its insufferable new president, decided to send a bulldozer to dismantle my perfectly legal, historically significant, and rather beautiful stone bridge over the Willow Creek on my own property, well, let's just say my patience ran out faster than a free beer at a frat party. And let me tell you the story of how Alistair Sterling's $6 million Lakeside McMansion ended up with a surprise indoor swimming pool, courtesy of that very same Willow Creek. It's a wild one. Drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from, because you're not going to want to miss this. It all started, as these things often do, with a change in leadership. Our little corner of the world, a rustic stretch of properties bordering the Willow Creek Nature Preserve, had always been a live and let live sort of place. My land included a significant portion of the creek frontage and, a little further upstream, a small, privately owned hydroelectric dam that my grandfather, an eccentric but brilliant engineer, had built back in the 50s. It wasn't a commercial behemoth, just a clever bit of renewable energy that powered my workshop and a couple of outbuildings, and it came with some fairly robust water rights. The bridge in question was a charming moss-covered stone arch, also Granddad's handiwork, providing access to a secluded meadow on the other side of the creek where I kept some beehives and a small orchard. It was on my land, maintained by me, and had been there for over 60 years without a whisper of complaint. Then came Alistair Sterling. Sterling, a man whose personality was as overbearing as his cologne, had recently purchased the old Henderson estate downstream, razed the historic farmhouse, and erected what can only be described as a monument to questionable taste and new money, a sprawling, glass and chrome edifice he unironically called Sterling Point. It loomed over the lake that Willow Creek fed into, a gleaming white elephant thumbing its nose at the surrounding natural beauty. With his purchase came an automatic position of power in our loosely organized HOA, and he quickly maneuvered himself into the presidency, promising beautification and upholding standards. We all know what that usually means. The first hint of trouble was a crisp, cream-colored envelope bearing the newly redesigned HOA logo, a pretentious golden swan for crying out loud. Inside, a curt letter informed me of an unauthorized structure encroaching upon the community's riparian vista, specifically citing a certain rustic bridge, my bridge. The letter, penned in a florid style that screamed Sterling, demanded its immediate removal at my expense to preserve the aesthetic integrity and natural flow of the Willow Creek waterway. I laughed at first. Surely this was a mistake. I fired off a polite but firm reply, complete with copies of my property survey map clearly showing the bridge well within my boundaries, the original county permits for its construction, Granddad was meticulous, and a gentle reminder that my water rights and dam operations upstream were also well documented and historically established. I even included a charming old photo of my grandmother posing on the bridge in a poodle skirt. I figured that would be the end of it. How naive I was. Sterling, it turned out, was not a man who concerned himself with inconvenient things like facts or property lines when they interfered with his grand vision, or perhaps his view from that monstrosity he called a home. His mansion, you see, was situated such that my quaint little bridge, nestled amongst the willows, was just visible from his expansive sun deck. Apparently, authentic, rustic charm wasn't part of his preferred riparian vista. He probably envisioned a sterile, unblemished stretch of water leading to his gleaming palace. The man probably thought nature itself needed a permit from his HOA. The situation was about to escalate from a minor annoyance to all-out suburban warfare, and I, armed with engineering knowledge inherited from my grandfather and a rapidly dwindling supply of patience, was about to become an unwilling general. The response from Alistair Sterling when it came was not another letter. Oh no, that would have been far too civil. Instead, I received a visit from the man himself, flanked by 2 other HOA board members who looked about as comfortable as cats at a dog show. Sterling, resplendent in a salmon-pink golf shirt that strained slightly over his midsection and reeking of something eye-wateringly expensive, didn't bother with pleasantries. He strode onto my porch as if he owned it, his shiny loafers scuffing on the welcome mat my daughter had made. "About this bridge business," he began, his voice a low growl that attempted to convey authority, but mostly sounded like a constipated bulldog. "We've reviewed your documents." The way he said documents made it sound like I'd submitted crayon drawings. "And the board maintains its position. That structure is an eyesore and a potential flood hazard." An eyesore? My beautiful historic bridge? A flood hazard? This from a man whose newly built mega mansion was, I suspected, perilously close to the 100-year floodplain of the lake it lorded over. The irony was so thick you could spread it on toast. I calmly reiterated my position, pointing out that the bridge had withstood 60 years of spring thaws and autumn storms without causing a single issue, and that its design actually allowed for excellent water flow. "Perhaps," I suggested, my voice dripping with forced politeness, "you're confusing it with the potential drainage issues from large-scale impervious surface construction downstream." I gestured vaguely in the direction of Sterling Point. His face, already ruddy, deepened to a shade alarmingly close to his shirt. One of his flunkies, a nervous man named Peterson who always looked like he'd lost his car keys, coughed pointedly. Sterling ignored him. "The HOA has broad powers to ensure community standards," he blustered, puffing out his chest, "and we've determined that bridge is not up to standard. You have 30 days to remove it, or we will have it removed for you and bill you for the costs." I remember just looking at him, this peacock of a man, standing on my property, threatening to destroy something precious to me, something that was legally mine. The sheer audacity was breathtaking. "Mr. Sterling," I said, my voice dangerously quiet, "let me be perfectly clear. That bridge is on my private property. You and your HOA have absolutely no jurisdiction here. If you or anyone contracted by you so much as sets foot on my land with the intent to damage my property, I will consider it trespass and vandalism, and I will pursue all available legal remedies. Am I understood?" For a moment, he looked taken aback, perhaps unused to anyone standing up to him. His eyes, small and hard, narrowed. He clearly wasn't accustomed to his pronouncements being questioned. The two board members shifted uncomfortably. Then, a slow, condescending smirk spread across his face. "We'll see about that," he said, turning on his heel. "You'll be hearing from our lawyers. Famous last words, as they say." I immediately called my own lawyer, Sarah, a sharp, no-nonsense woman who had helped my family with estate matters for years. After I explained the situation, she sighed. "Another HOA Napoleon," she said. "All right, send me copies of everything. Your deeds, the surveys, the bridge permits, the HOA's letters, your correspondence. We'll draft a cease and desist that'll make his hair curl. Some of these guys think an HOA presidency makes them king of a fiefdom." I spent the next few days meticulously gathering every scrap of paper, every photograph, every historical record I had concerning the bridge and my property lines. I even dug out Granddad's original blueprints for the dam, just in case. Something told me this wasn't going to be a simple legal scuffle. Sterling struck me as the type who, when faced with reason and law, would simply try to bulldoze his way through, literally, as it turned out. My neighbors, many of whom had lived here longer than I had, were sympathetic. Old Mrs. Henderson, whose family had sold the land to Sterling, stopped me by the creek path. "Be careful with that one, dear," she warned, her eyes troubled. "He tried to tell me the ancient oak tree on my new property line was impeding his morning sun and suggested I cut it down. Some people have no respect." Her words were an understatement. Sterling didn't just lack respect. He seemed to possess an active disdain for anything that didn't conform to his sterile, oversized vision of the world. The 30 days ticked by, filled with an uneasy tension. Sarah sent the cease and desist, a masterpiece of legal prose that clearly outlined Sterling's overreach and the potential consequences. We received a blustering, dismissive reply from the HOA's lawyer, a slick city type whose letterhead probably cost more than my annual property taxes. It was clear Sterling wasn't backing down. He was on a collision course with reality, and unfortunately, my bridge was in his path. The sheer arrogance of it all was what got to me. It wasn't just about the bridge anymore, it was about the principle. This man thought he could just waltz in, rewrite the rules, and destroy personal property based on nothing more than his personal whim and a misplaced sense of authority. I started checking my security cameras more frequently, the ones I'd installed after a few minor incidents of petty vandalism years ago. I made sure their angles covered the bridge and all access points from the road. A knot of cold anger was solidifying in my gut. I wasn't going to let this bully win. Little did I know how far he would actually go, or how spectacularly his own actions would set the stage for his downfall. The calm before the storm, as they say, is often the most deceptive, and a storm was definitely brewing over Willow Creek. The 30th day passed without incident. Then the 31st. I allowed myself a small sigh of relief. Perhaps Sterling had finally listened to his lawyers, or perhaps some vestige of common sense had penetrated his thick skull. I should have known better. On the morning of the 32nd day, I was jolted awake, not by my alarm clock, but by a sound that made my blood run cold. The unmistakable roar and clatter of heavy machinery, far too close for comfort. I threw on some clothes and sprinted out the door, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The sight that greeted me as I rounded the bend in my driveway stopped me dead in my tracks. There, on my property, was a large, bright yellow bulldozer, its massive blade already tearing into the earth at the approach to my beautiful stone bridge. Two men in hard hats were supervising, one of them gesturing animatedly towards the structure. And standing a little way off, arms crossed, a smug expression plastered across his face, was Alistair Sterling himself, looking like a Roman emperor surveying the destruction of a conquered city. For a moment, I was too stunned to speak, too horrified. Then, a surge of adrenaline-fueled rage, cold and pure, washed over me. "Sterling!" I roared, my voice cracking. "What in the seven hells do you think you're doing?" He turned, that infuriating smirk widening. "Just a little community improvement project, my dear," he called back, his tone dripping with condescension. "That unsightly hazard is finally coming down. We even got the county to sign off on an emergency removal order due to imminent structural collapse and waterway obstruction." This was a blatant lie, I knew it. My bridge was as solid as the day it was built, and I'd had it inspected by an independent engineer just 5 years prior. He was banking on me not knowing the intricacies of county bureaucracy, or perhaps he'd managed to bully or bribe some low-level clerk. The bulldozer operator, seemingly oblivious to our confrontation, revved the engine and lowered the blade, gouging a huge chunk out of the stone archway. A piece of the elegant iron railing, hand-forged by my grandfather, twisted and snapped. I felt a physical pain, as if a part of me was being ripped apart. "Get that machine off my property, Sterling, now!" I screamed, already dialing 911 on my phone. "You're trespassing! This is criminal damage!" Sterling just chuckled. "Oh, I don't think so. The HOA has a legal easement for waterway maintenance, you see, very broad, covers situations just like this." He waved a piece of paper vaguely. "It's all perfectly above board." I knew that was rubbish. Any such easement, if it even existed for our informal HOA, wouldn't grant the right to demolish private structures without due process, court orders, and certainly not based on fabricated emergencies. The deputies arrived with surprising speed, their sirens wailing in the distance. By the time they pulled up, a significant portion of the bridge was already a heartbreaking pile of rubble. Sterling, ever the performer, immediately adopted a posture of wronged civic duty, explaining to the officers that he was merely acting in the community's best interest, removing a dangerous structure. He presented his emergency order, which, upon closer inspection by the senior deputy, looked suspiciously like a standard work order form with some hastily typed additions. I, meanwhile, was frantically showing the deputies my property deeds, the survey maps, the original permits, and pointing to my very visible "no trespassing" signs. I also informed them that the entire incident was being recorded by multiple security cameras, including crystal-clear footage of the bulldozer arriving and Sterling directing the demolition. The senior deputy, a man named Miller who had a reputation for being thorough and fair, looked from Sterling's smarmy face to my own, then back to the mangled remains of my bridge. His expression was grim. "Mr. Sterling," Deputy Miller said slowly, "this document you have appears to be irregular. And unless you can provide a court order specifically authorizing the demolition of a structure on this lady's private property, you and your crew are committing several serious offenses here." Sterling's composure finally cracked. His face went pale, then flushed an angry red. "This is an outrage. I am the HOA president. That bridge was a menace. It was a historically significant permitted structure on my land, you vandal." I shot back, my voice trembling with suppressed fury. Deputy Miller held up a hand. "Ma'am, please. Mr. Sterling, I'm going to have to ask your crew to cease all activity immediately and remove their equipment from this property. We're going to need to sort this out down at the station." The bulldozer operator, looking thoroughly uncomfortable, quickly shut down the machine. Sterling began to bluster about lawsuits and influential friends, but Deputy Miller was unmoved. He took statements, collected Sterling's paperwork, and informed him that he would likely be facing charges for trespass and destruction of property. As the deputies escorted a fuming Sterling and his crestfallen crew off my land, I stood amidst the ruins of my grandfather's bridge. The beautiful stone arches were shattered, the pathway gone. Willow Creek flowed on, indifferent, but now it felt like a scar, a wound. The smug satisfaction on Sterling's face as the bulldozer first struck stone was seared into my memory. He had underestimated me. He had mistaken my patience for weakness. He had no idea the lengths to which I would go, not just for justice, but for retribution. He thought he was powerful because he had money and a fancy title. He forgot that I had something far more potent, a deep understanding of the very creek he so cavalierly claimed to be protecting, and upstream, a privately owned dam with Granddad's ingenious, if slightly outdated, controls. As I looked at the wreckage, a cold, hard resolve settled in my heart. Sterling wanted to talk about natural water flow. Oh, I'd show him natural water flow. I'd show him the true power of Willow Creek. The plan began to form then, a seed of an idea that, watered by my anger and a healthy dose of engineering know-how, would soon grow into something truly spectacular. He had brought a bulldozer to a water fight. He was about to find out how badly outmatched he truly was. My mind was already racing, calculating flow rates, spillway capacities, and the precise topography of the land between my dam and Sterling's ostentatious lakeside palace. The game was far from over. It had just entered a new, much more interesting phase. The days following the bridge demolition were a blur of legal consultations, insurance claims, and simmering rage. Sarah, my lawyer, was apoplectic when she saw the security footage. "This isn't just an HOA dispute anymore," she said, her eyes narrowed. "This is willful destruction of private property, trespass, conspiracy. Sterling's arrogance is going to bury him. We'll sue him, the HOA, and the bulldozer company into the next century." While Sarah prepared the legal onslaught, I focused on my own, more direct form of recourse. The sight of Sterling's smug face as my bridge crumbled was a constant replay in my mind, fueling a cold, methodical anger. He wanted to mess with my property, my heritage. Fine. Two could play at that game. My grandfather, as I mentioned, was an engineer, and his interests were eclectic. The small hydroelectric dam he'd built on Willow Creek, about a mile upstream from my main property and considerably further upstream from Sterling Point, was a marvel of 1950s ingenuity. It wasn't a towering concrete monolith like the Hoover Dam. It was more of an oversized weir with adjustable sluice gates and a small turbine house. Critically, it controlled the flow of a significant portion of Willow Creek's headwaters. For decades it had operated under a set of grandfathered water rights that were, shall we say, generously interpretable, especially regarding periodic channel maintenance releases to clear sediment. Granddad had been a stickler for maintenance, and I had all his logs, all his operational manuals. I knew that dam like the back of my hand. I knew its capacity, its quirks, and exactly how much water it could unleash if I chose to open the gates wide. My first step was research, meticulous and obsessive. I pulled up geological survey maps, paying close attention to the topography between my dam and Sterling's Lakeside Folly. I studied historical flood data for Willow Creek and the lake it fed. Sterling Point, in its gleaming white newness, was built on a slight prominence overlooking the lake, but that prominence wasn't as high as Sterling probably thought. The previous owner, old Mr. Henderson, had always talked about how that particular stretch of lakeside land got a bit boggy during very heavy spring melts. Sterling, in his haste to build his monument to ego, had likely ignored or dismissed such local wisdom, probably relying on minimum code requirements that didn't account for, say, an upstream dam owner with a serious grudge and a deep understanding of hydrology. I then made a discreet call to an old college friend, David, now a highly respected civil engineer specializing in water resource management. Without going into specifics about my intentions, I posed a hypothetical scenario involving controlled water releases from an upstream reservoir and their potential downstream effects, given certain flow rates and topographical features. David, bless his nerdy heart, got quite animated. He enthused, launching into talk of Manning's equation, Weir coefficients, and hydrographs. I scribbled notes furiously, absorbing the technical details. He confirmed my suspicion. A sustained, significant increase in outflow from my dam, especially if timed with a period of already saturated ground or a decent rainstorm, could definitely cause localized nuisance flooding in low-lying areas downstream, particularly around the lake's inlet where Sterling Point was situated. Of course, David added, you'd need to be careful. Uncontrolled releases can have serious consequences, but a well-managed pulse of water? Theoretically, it could temporarily raise water levels by a foot or two in specific zones, especially if the downstream channel has any constrictions or if recent construction has altered natural floodplains. Recent construction like, say, a massive new mansion with extensive hardscaping and retaining walls built with little regard for natural drainage? Bingo. The final piece of my data gathering involved Sterling himself. I made a few casual inquiries among the local contractors and suppliers. It turned out Sterling had cut a few corners on his grand palace. There were whispers about rushed landscaping, a drainage system that was value-engineered, red, cheap, and inadequate, and a basement that, according to one disgruntled plumber I knew, was just begging for a sump pump to fail. The picture was becoming clearer. Sterling hadn't just built a house, he'd built a beautifully appointed $6 million water trap. Now, I needed to plan the execution. This couldn't be a catastrophic dam-breaking flood. That would be illegal, dangerous, and would land me in far more trouble than Sterling. No, this had to be a controlled, deniable event. A significant but managed release for essential sediment flushing and upstream reservoir management, as my grandfather's old operational guidelines vaguely put it. I studied the weather forecasts like a hawk. What I needed was a decent multi-day rain event, enough to get the ground nicely saturated and the creek already running a bit high. This would provide cover, make the subsequent surge from my dam seem like a natural, albeit severe, consequence of the weather. It would also pre-fill the downstream system, making my contribution more effective. I spent a week going over the dam's mechanics. The sluice gates were old but robust, operated by a series of heavy cranks and gears. I lubricated everything, checked the seals, and ran a few minor test adjustments to ensure they were all working smoothly. I felt a strange sense of connection to my grandfather during this process, as if he were there, nodding approvingly at my meticulous preparation. He'd always had a strong sense of justice, and a rather mischievous streak. I imagined he'd find the poetic justice of using his creation to deal with a bully like Sterling rather amusing. I also documented everything. I created a new logbook for the dam, noting preparations for scheduled annual channel maintenance and sediment release, citing specific clauses from the original operational permits. I took photographs of the current water levels, the sediment buildup behind the dam, which was actually quite minimal, but who was going to check? And the corrosion on the gate mechanisms that necessitated a full-range operation. If questions were asked later, I would have a plausible, if slightly stretched, explanation. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about engineering a perfect, elegant solution. Sterling had used brute force and lies. I would use precision, knowledge, and the immutable laws of physics. He had attacked a symbol of my heritage. I would use that same heritage, my grandfather's dam, to deliver a response he would never forget. The waiting was the hardest part. Checking the weather apps multiple times a day, watching the skies, feeling the subtle shifts in barometric pressure. It was like coiling a giant spring, tighter and tighter, waiting for the precise moment to release it. And Alistair Sterling, blissfully unaware, continued his reign of terror over the HOA, finding Mrs. with Gable for the unapproved shade of beige on her mailbox and demanding Mr. Henderson trim a perfectly healthy maple tree because a single leaf had dared to fall into his pristine swimming pool. He had no idea that a far more significant water-related issue was about to demand his full and undivided attention. The forecast finally delivered. A slow-moving weather system was predicted to stall over our region, bringing 3 to 4 days of steady soaking rain. The kind of rain that fills creeks, saturates the ground, and makes old-timers nod wisely and say, "River's gonna rise." It was perfect. On the first day of the rain, a Tuesday, I drove up to the dam. The air was cool and damp, the sky a bruised purple. Willow Creek was already running faster, its voice a deeper murmur. I began my pre-maintenance checks, meticulously documenting every step in my logbook. I noted the incoming rainfall, the rising water levels in the reservoir behind the dam, and the observed need to increase outflow to manage upstream pressure and facilitate sediment scouring. It all sounded terribly official. By Wednesday afternoon, the rain had been falling steadily for over 24 hours. The ground squelched under my boots. The reservoir was nearing its upper comfortable limit. Downstream, Willow Creek would be a torrent, and the Lake Sterling Point overlooked would be swollen. This was the critical window. Any additional water I released now would have a disproportionate impact. I took a deep breath. This was it. There was no turning back. With a heavy wrench, I began the process of opening the main sluice gate, not all at once, but incrementally, carefully. The old gears groaned in protest, then engaged. Water, dark and urgent, began to surge through the newly widened opening, a roaring cascade that immediately increased the creek's volume below the dam. I moved to the secondary gates, repeating the process. I wasn't throwing them wide open in a reckless deluge. That would be too obvious, too dangerous. Instead, I was aiming for a significant, sustained increase in outflow, perhaps tripling the normal peak flow, enough to push the downstream system beyond its comfortable capacity, especially with the ongoing rain. I imagined it as turning up a massive faucet. The sound of the water was immense, a thunderous roar that filled the small valley. I felt a tremor through the concrete structure of the dam, a testament to the power I was unleashing. It was both terrifying and exhilarating. I stayed at the dam for several hours, monitoring the outflow, making small adjustments, and, of course, dutifully recording everything in my logbook under headings like optimizing flow for channel desilting and controlled release to alleviate upstream hydrostatic pressure. It was all perfectly optimall.com. Justifiable if one didn't know the true vengeful intent behind the jargon. By late afternoon, I judged the release to be optimal. A colossal volume of water was now charging down Willow Creek. I closed up the control house, took one last look at the raging torrent, and drove back to my house, my heart a strange mix of apprehension and grim satisfaction. The waiting game began again, but this time it was different. I wasn't waiting for an opportunity. I was waiting for the inevitable consequences of my actions to unfold. The first reports started trickling in on Thursday morning via the neighborhood social media page, which Sterling usually dominated with his pronouncements and complaints. Mrs. Periwinkle, who lived on a property bordering the creek about halfway between me and the lake, posted a somewhat alarmed message. "Creek is higher than I've ever seen it. Anyone else experiencing this? My lower garden is getting a bit swampy." Then Tom Albright, whose land was closer to the lake inlet, chimed in. "You're not kidding, Mildred. The water's creeping up my back lawn. Never seen it this high, even in the '96 flood." I allowed myself a small grim smile. My channel maintenance was clearly having an effect. I made a mental note to offer to help Mrs. Periwinkle with some sandbags later, just to maintain appearances. By Thursday afternoon, the tone on the community page shifted from mild concern to outright panic, especially from residents near the lake. The sustained heavy rain, combined with my generous contribution from upstream, was doing its work. The lake was visibly rising, inundating docks and low-lying shorelines. And then, the posts I'd been waiting for started to appear. They were initially vague. Heard there's serious flooding down at the end of Lakeshore Drive. Lakeshore Drive, of course, was where Sterling Point lorded over its domain. Then came more specific, almost gleeful, from some of Sterling's less ardent admirers anyway, reports. Someone just drove past Sterling's place, says his whole front lawn is a pond. Just got a text from my cousin who works for the landscaping company that does Sterling's place. Says the water is up to the ridiculously oversized marble fountain in the circular driveway. I pictured it vividly. The pristine, obsessively manicured lawns, the imported Italian marble, the perfectly sculpted topiaries, all slowly succumbing to the muddy, relentless advance of Willow Creek's amplified fury. The piece de resistance came late Thursday evening. A frantic Alabama El Caps post from none other than Alistair Sterling's equally odious wife Beatrice, who usually only posted about her charity galas or her prize-winning poodles, which I swear, looked as miserable as everyone else around the Sterlings. Our basement is flooding, water everywhere, Alistair is having a meltdown, this is a disaster. Someone do something! The sheer, unadulterated panic in her post was, I confess, deeply satisfying. I could almost hear Sterling's apoplectic sputtering, see his salmon-pink face turning a delightful shade of purple as the murky waters of Willow Creek, the very creek he had sought to control and beautify by destroying my bridge, invaded his precious $6 million sanctuary. His riparian vista was now an inundation catastrophe. I poured myself a generous glass of my grandfather's favorite single malt whiskey, the good stuff I saved for special occasions. This, I decided, definitely qualified. I raised my glass in a silent toast to Granddad, to poetic justice, and to the awesome, untamable power of water when guided by a patient engineer with a very long memory and a very specific target. The rain continued to fall, a gentle drumming on my roof, a soothing counterpoint to the distant metaphorical gnashing of teeth down at Sterling Point. I slept very well that night. The aftermath of what the local news eventually dubbed the Willow Creek surge was, for Alistair Sterling, nothing short of catastrophic. For me, it was a master class in watching someone hoist themselves by their own petard, or in this case, flood themselves with their own arrogance. On Friday morning, with the rain finally tapering off to a drizzle, I took a drive, purely for observational purposes, of course. The lower sections of Lakeshore Drive were still partially submerged, and emergency vehicles, mostly belonging to overworked drainage crews and bewildered-looking insurance adjusters, were navigating the mess. And then there was Sterling Point, or, as it now appeared, Sterling Sunken Folly. The water had receded somewhat from its peak, but the devastation was evident. The immaculate lawns were a sea of mud and debris. The ridiculously oversized marble fountain was tilted at a jaunty angle, looking like a drunken Roman emperor. The lower windows of the mansion were dark and streaked with grime, and I could see sandbags piled haphazardly around the main entrance, a desperate and clearly inadequate defense. ServPro vans were already on site, their crews looking grimly at the scale of the task ahead. Sterling himself was out front, his usually pristine golf attire replaced by muddy boots and a stained windbreaker. His face was a mask of disbelief and fury, his slick-back hair askew. He was gesturing wildly, shouting at a beleaguered-looking man in a suit who I presumed was his insurance agent. Beatrice Sterling was dabbing at her eyes with a silk handkerchief, looking utterly bereft amidst the chaos. It was a scene of utter, unadulterated homeowner horror. And I won't lie, a small, satisfied smile played on my lips. He'd brought a bulldozer to my property. I'd merely, optimized the hydraulic efficiency of the creek that happened to flow past his. Naturally, the blame game started almost immediately. Sterling, once he regained some semblance of coherence, began pointing fingers. His first target was the county, for inadequate flood defenses. Then, predictably, his attention turned upstream. He'd heard rumors about my dam maintenance, and his tiny, suspicious brain started putting two and two together, arriving at a sum of pure, unadulterated rage directed squarely at me. That weekend I received a series of increasingly hysterical phone calls from Sterling, which I mostly let go to voicemail for Sarah, my lawyer, to review. The messages were a delightful blend of threats, accusations, and sputtering incoherence. You did this. I know you did this, you damn Luddite with your rusty old dam. You'll pay for this. I'll sue you into oblivion. My basement is ruined. My priceless Persian rugs, my home theater. The sheer anguish in his voice over his waterlogged consumer goods was, frankly, music to my ears. When he finally caught me live, I feigned polite concern. Alistair, how dreadful. All that rain, it's just terrible what can happen. We had some localized issues up here too. Had to do some emergency releases from the dam to manage the pressure. Standard procedure, you know. All documented. Documented, he shrieked. You deliberately flooded me. This was revenge for that dilapidated bridge, wasn't it? Alistair. I said, my voice calm and reasonable. My bridge, which you illegally demolished, was a permitted, historically significant structure. My dam operations are also permitted, and have been in place for over 60 years. Perhaps the issue isn't my rusty old dam, but the fact you built a $6 million mansion on what old man Henderson always said was basically a sponge. Did you even check the floodplain maps properly before you poured that foundation? There was a sputtering sound on the other end, then the line went dead. Sarah, meanwhile, was having a field day. He's accusing you of what exactly? She asked, a dangerous glint in her eye. Manipulating weather patterns, being a vengeful river god. His claims are ludicrous. Your dam operations are defensible, especially given the grandfathered status and your meticulous logbooks. His illegal destruction of your bridge, however, is a slam dunk. We have him on video, for crying out loud. Sterling did try to sue, of course. His lawyers, the same slick city types, filed a massive, rambling complaint alleging negligence, willful misconduct, and probably witchcraft for all I knew. Sarah's response was a concise, brutal motion to dismiss, coupled with our own countersuit for the destruction of the bridge, trespass, emotional distress, and punitive damages. We also made sure to include copies of my dam operation logs, the historical permits, and an independent hydrologist report, commissioned by Sarah, post-flood, which stated that while my releases had contributed to the downstream water volume, the primary cause of Sterling's specific flooding was likely a combination of unusually heavy rainfall, pre-existing high ground saturation, and potentially substandard or poorly designed drainage infrastructure on the affected property itself. That last bit was key. It turned out Sterling's value-engineered drainage was indeed woefully inadequate, and his mansion's finished basement floor was, in fact, several inches below the projected 50-year flood level for the lake, something his builders had apparently overlooked in their rush. His insurance company, upon discovering this, began making noises about denying his claim due to negligence and misrepresentation. The fallout for Sterling was spectacular. His mansion was uninhabitable for months. The cost of repairs, even if insurance eventually paid out a fraction, was astronomical. His reputation in the community, already shaky, plummeted. Other HOA members, seeing the financial black hole Sterling had become and the legal mess he dragged them into, our lawsuit named the HOA as a co-defendant for authorizing the bridge demolition, started to revolt. There were emergency board meetings, hushed conferences, and a growing sense of buyer's remorse regarding their tyrannical president. The smoking gun for Sterling's downfall wasn't just the flood, it was the accumulation of his own arrogance. The video of him smugly watching my bridge being torn down, played on a loop in my lawyer's office, was particularly damning. His attempt to use a bogus emergency order was exposed. His blatant disregard for property rights and due process became undeniable. Within 6 months, Alistair Sterling was forced to resign as HOA president. His beloved Sterling Point, now bearing the faint but unmistakable aroma of mildew and resentment, went on the market at a significantly reduced price. Last I heard, he and Beatrice had downsized to a condo in a less flood-prone, but also less prestigious, part of the state. The HOA, under new, more sensible leadership, sheepishly approached me with an offer to settle our lawsuit. They paid for the complete reconstruction of my bridge to its original specifications, plus a handsome sum for damages and legal fees. They even issued a formal public apology. I had my grandfather's bridge back, stronger and more beautiful than ever. The bees in my meadow buzzed contentedly, and the apples in my orchard seemed sweeter that year. Willow Creek flowed on. Sometimes a gentle murmur, sometimes a respectable roar, but always a reminder of the delicate balance between nature, human endeavor, and the occasional, exquisitely engineered dose of pro-revenge. I learned that patience, while a virtue, has its limits. And sometimes, when pushed too far, even the most peace-loving, patient engineer might find themselves consulting old dam schematics and weather forecasts with a glint of righteous mischief in their eye. So, What's the craziest thing your HOA has ever tried to pull? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this story of a flood of justice, make sure to like and subscribe, because I've got a feeling this won't be my last tangle with entitlement.